Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming and welcome to anybody who's watching online. Could I ask you all to make sure your devices are on silent, but please do tweet. We always like seeing tweets. The hashtag is 2015climate. Before we get started, I'm just going to flag a couple of other events that are coming up. On the 18th of May, we have Connie Hedegaard speaking, and she was at the forefront of climate negotiations in Europe. So she's really worth seeing. That lecture is filling up very quickly, so I would urge you, if you haven't yet registered, please do get online. Also, it goes without saying that this is the first of this term's seminars, so do have a look at the website and see what else we've got coming up for that. So on to this afternoon, we're very fortunate to have Simon Caney, who is co-director of the Human Rights for Future Generations programme here at the Oxford Martin School. And his work encompasses work with the IPCC, with the World Bank and the Nuffield Committee on Bioethics, sorry. And so he's very widely consulting on how to enshrine the rights of future generations in what we do now. Today he's going to be looking at how we realise those rights in a warming world. It's a very important topic, obviously given COP21 coming up this year. So I hope you'll welcome him, and we'll take questions at the end, so we'll make sure we've got plenty of time for that. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. And thank you for coming here. So yes, this is a really important year for climate change and climate change governance as we move towards Paris, but also because there are these negotiations concerning the Sustainable Development Goals taking place sort of on a dual track, which will also bear on climate change. And what I want to do is to make a case for why a human rights framework provides a really helpful way of thinking about the challenges posed by dangerous climate change. And I'm going to do that by sort of drawing on or drawing attention to 5 different themes, 5 different ways in which I think human rights should enter and do enter the picture. So I won't go through all 5 now, we'll just come across them one by one, and I want to focus perhaps more on the first 4 than the 5th one. Let me say a few things by way of background. So I'm just going to scroll ahead. I think human rights are a special kind of moral value. They are rights that you have, entitlements that you have as human beings, so in virtue of your humanity. And they establish moral thresholds below which human beings should not be allowed to fall. So it's nice if people don't fall beneath it. It's a demand of justice that people don't fall beneath a threshold. They are universal, so they are ascribed to all human beings, and they have a moral priority. So there are other things that are good and decent to do and charitable to do, but human rights have a sort of moral urgency. And when I'm defending a human rights approach, I want to contrast it a bit with other ways that people think about climate change. So one very dominant way of thinking of climate change will be through cost-benefit analysis, very prevalent amongst economists. Another way of thinking about it is to think about it in terms of security. The Pentagon, for example, many years ago actually released a report saying that climate change was a security threat. Security can be interpreted in different ways, but they meant as a trigger for violent conflict. And sometimes people think of climate change in terms of values other than its impact on human beings, so non-anthropocentric ethics. I'm not going to criticize any of those other approaches. I just think they're incomplete and they miss a really big part of the picture. I'll say 2 other things about human rights and climate change before kind of launching into my 5 theses. So one is, and when I talk about human rights, I really mean moral rights. I mean ones that you have irrespective of the legal situation. And so international lawyers will often talk about human rights, meaning those which are in international codified documents and covenants. And I think it's very important that they are in there, but if they weren't in there, you would still have, on my view, these moral rights. And so I will refer to formulations you find, for example, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. But it's not really a claim about the legal rights. And one final sort of prefatory comment is people like myself have been pushing this case for a while, and you do find human rights discourse entering into climate dialogues. So in November 2007, there was a Mali declaration on the human dimension of global climate change, which appealed to human rights. The Human Rights Council passed a resolution in 2008 expressing concern that climate change poses immediate and far-reaching threats to people and has implications for the full enjoyment of human rights. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a report in 2009 saying that climate change was a human rights issue. And in the Cancun negotiations, there's a reference to human rights in the preamble. But are they right? You know, is it a sensible thing to do to try and bring the concept of human rights into contact with climate change? Here's now when I want to kind of launch into my 5 theses. So I think it is very helpful because one of the theses is that the climate change poses a severe threat to the enjoyment of human rights. Climate change, I think, is terrible for very many reasons. But one of them is it denies people of what they're entitled to as a matter of justice, as a matter of their rights. And I'm going to put forward 3 human rights, slightly different from the way they're often formulated. I'd be very curious to know if anyone dissents from these human rights. So one is, I think you all have a human right not to be deprived arbitrarily of life. That is, if people act in ways that arbitrarily deprive your life, that's a human rights violation. The arbitrarily is in there to cover cases like, well, what about a war? Or what if people disagree about capital punishment? But let's just bracket those. Now, if you accept that as a human right, and I've tried to make it as minimal as possible, then climate change clearly jeopardizes and violates human rights because it leads to loss of life through heat stress, through extreme precipitation, storm surges. I've drawn from the most recent IPCC report where it refers to the number of deaths from heat waves. So it's not just that climate change lowers global GDP, or as Nick Stern put it, it's an externality, it's a market failure. It is those, but that doesn't really capture the moral reality. It's a deprivation of people's right to life and their right to health. So I put it here in a very negative formulation that people have a right that others don't deprive people of their health. So you have a negative duty not to harm people in this way. The international covenants put a much kind of stronger one, which is you have a positive duty to ensure that everyone enjoys the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Now I endorse that wholeheartedly. But some people don't. They query ideas about whether we have positive duties to protect other people's health. But even if we're skeptical about positive duties, and I want to stress I'm not, but if we were, surely we have a negative duty not to do things like build factories or engage in economic activity, which foreseeably and avoidably denies people of good health, when we don't have to do it. And yet, if you look in the IPCC reports, the one that came out earlier this year, late last year, you'll see on the chapter on human health a catalogue of all the disastrous health impacts of climate change, whether it's food and waterborne diseases or malnutrition or injury. I also think you have a human right, to be free from poverty. And again, you might talk about positive duties to help ensure people sort of don't fall beneath a decent standard of living. I wholeheartedly endorse that. But you don't need that. All you have to think is that there is a negative duty on all of us not to act in ways that deprive people of access to the things they need for a minimally decent human life. Where what I mean by a minimally decent human life involves, at the very minimum, things like access to food, to clean water, But again, just to refer to the IPCC, we know that it's going to really undermine food security, that there's going to be desertification, crop failure, there's going to be the creation of a new poor. I mean, it's a message that just keeps coming on through. We know it'll happen in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and we know the mechanisms. The numbers we may not be precise on, but we know that it's predictable it'll jeopardize people's access to food. So, for these reasons, my first claim then is we should think of climate change as a direct threat to the enjoyment of human rights. Now, sometimes people say, well, why does this matter? We know it's bad. Why do we need to think of it as a human rights violation? So here are some thoughts that preemptively strike if you're having that thought. So one is someone might say, I know battery and assault is bad, but why do you need to say you have a right not to be battered and assaulted? Or, I know rape is bad, but you don't need to say you have a right to it. So I'd be curious if anyone here thought, yeah, actually I'm persuaded by that. We don't have rights not to be assaulted or raped. I think what I want to say here is we need to have the term that best describes the moral situation. And here we use rights language to identify things which we think individuals, all of them, are equally entitled to have, where they can, so to speak, I'm not going to do this, slam their fist on the table and say, I'm entitled to this. It has strong and binding duties on the rest of you. That's what we want to say in the physical assault and other kinds of cases. And I think it's exactly the same here. And I think it's an advantage over sort of more cost-benefit analyses, which just look at aggregate levels of wealth or GDP, but they miss out what happens to individual human beings as long as GDP goes up. So that's why I think it does matter what terms you use to condemn things like climate change, and it's helpful to see it as a human rights violation. We also need it for at least three other reasons. I mean, one is climate change comes in degrees. It's not that either we have it or we don't. And many people will know that there's a 2-degree target. But in many ways, the 2-degree target is pretty arbitrary. It arose in the mid-90s when the European Council came up with it, and it sort of solidified. And sometimes at COP negotiations, people say it should be 1.5. Now, why do we use this? Well, it's a nice round number, and I suspect it's something that people think, at least thought, maybe not nowadays, that they could get a coalition around. But we want to know a bit more than that. What's the grounding for it? And ultimately, it's an ethical question. What counts as dangerous here? What's the level with which we cannot put up? And the UNFCCC in its Article 2 refers to dangerous anthropogenic interference. And my suggestion is, well, one of the criteria we should use to define what counts as dangerous is, does it systematically undermine human rights? Actually, it does on 2 degrees. It does on 1.5 degrees. If you don't like a human rights criterion, you'll need some other one. But the second point I'm saying here really is it provides a useful marker for helping to think what counts as dangerous. Yeah. 2 other points is I'll be talking a lot today about mitigating climate change, about reducing the pressures on the climate system. But there's also, crucially, that the matter of adaptation, of spending resources to enable people to cope with the ill effects of climate change, those effects to which we're already committed. But then we need to know, well, what kinds of things need protection? Some early IPCC reports said that climate change was bad because it was terrible for the insurance industry. So I thought, well, is that the sort of thing that really matters, right? I want the money to be spent on protecting people's human rights. That's a criterion that can tell us where adaptation funding should go. And the final thing I want to say on this point is that increasingly there's been a recognition of this concept of loss and damage. That is, there are going to be harmful effects of climate change where adaptation won't be sufficient. And a human rights approach can make very good sense of this, because you shouldn't violate a human right. But if you do violate it, then compensation is owed. And that makes sense of the idea of loss and damage as compensation for a rights violation. So if someone is saying, well, yeah, why does it matter we think about these in human rights terms? Those are some thoughts to answer that line of reasoning. I do want to stress the second thing. I'm not saying it's the only thing that we should worry about with climate change. You might think, I care about things like biodiversity loss, irrespective of its impact on human beings and their rights, and I do too. But this is a talk about human rights, so I'm going to talk about them, but I don't want to ignore others. Okay, so second theme. Someone might say, well, let's talk about preventing the harmful or dangerous climate change. We need to talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this chunk of text that I've put here, I think should help us guide how we think about reducing emissions. And just to decipher it from IPCC language, it says, and it draws from some research based from people based in Oxford, like Miles Allen and Dave Frame, who was once here, that humanity can emit 1 trillion tons of carbon if we want to have a 50% chance of avoiding an increase in global mean temperatures of 2 degrees. And we've already used up more than 0.5 trillion tons of that. So we have to think for the future in terms of having a budget, not of money, but a carbon budget of less than 0.5 trillion tons of carbon. As they will add and point out, this is ignoring lots of things. This is ignoring non-CO2 forcing. It's ignoring the possibility of greenhouse gases being emitted from when the permafrost melts. It's also saying 2 degrees is the right target, and it's assuming that a 50% chance is a reasonable gamble. If you think that it shouldn't be 50% gamble, and if you want a lower target, then we're going to have even less than 0.5 trillion. Now, the question is, how do we think about that 0.5 trillion tons of carbon, that budget? And, so this is just pointing out when it would run out. So if you look at this thing at the bottom, the trillionthton.org website, which I won't link to here, has this terrifying figure whirling around that is projecting when we'll use up the trillionth ton. So as of this morning, it was the 24th of May, 2039. So if you're in your early 20s, you'll be, sort of my age. So the question I want to ask then is, how do we think about this budget? And many people think, well, what we should do is take this budget and then have human rights to use it up, because it's a common pool. It's a common good that no one has a private ownership right over the atmospheric capacity of the world. So should we think about having human rights to emissions? And I want to say, ultimately, no, we shouldn't. But I want to talk you through why some people do and how they think about it. So the reasoning would be that it's part of humanity's entitlement, that no individual or country can say, oh, well, I'm entitled to that because of something I've done. It's just out there, and it should be shared amongst humanity. And then, we have at least two schools of thought. We have those like Aubrey Mayer, who ultimately think everyone should have an equal share. And he favors what he calls contraction and convergence. There are lots of variations about this, but many people ultimately think that each individual should have a human right to an equal share of the Earth's atmospheric capacity. I don't think Aubrey puts it in those terms. He would think of societies having equal shares. Then other people like Paul Baer and Tom Athanasiou have said we should take these greenhouse gases and distribute them to the world's poorest because they have a human right to develop. And that's how we should think about human rights and greenhouse gases. Now, this is the contraction and convergence model, where basically we contract over time and approximate the same amount. I want to put forward a third view, and it dissents from the idea you have a right to greenhouse gas emissions. Because speaking for myself, and I hope for you, I don't really care about greenhouse gas emissions, except that humanity should not emit too many of them. What I care about, and I hope that you do too, is people's interests and rights in things like food, or water, or education, or housing, or mobility. And those are what really matter, and that emissions matter only insofar as they're a byproduct of fossil fuels or agriculture, which are just means to an end. And as I put at the bottom, the key point is we shouldn't fetishize emissions. They're not what really matters. They do matter in that we can't exceed the cap. But if someone has more emissions than me, that doesn't matter. What matters are human rights for access to food, water, mobility, education, and so on. And since there are other ways of, at least in principle, of delivering and realizing rights that don't involve greenhouse gases, it's not that to enjoy my right to food, I necessarily need the same amount of greenhouse gases as someone else. The link for food, which I think is about 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions, is through things like nitrogen, which is released from fertilizer, or methane from livestock. But since there are other energy sources, and since there are ways of delivering food that don't involve that, you needn't eat meat, for example, I think we should focus on what really matters. So let's not think in terms of human rights to emissions, but human rights to important capabilities. And yeah, if you look at the human rights documents, you don't find a right to emit there, but you do find rights to food, or water, or education. And this fits in with the way that many people in the international negotiations are putting it, which is what matters are things like access equitably to sustainable development, or to sustainable and modern energy. But it's not one particular route to that form of energy. So what I want to say here then is not only is climate change a threat to human rights, but when we're trying to mitigate, when we're thinking about reducing that distribution of greenhouse gases, human rights does enter the picture. But it's not as simple as saying, oh, I have a right to emit. We should think about what those emissions are used to produce. And one very simple way I hope to persuade you of this is think about future generations and think about that $500 billion. If we're to ensure that future generations have a decent standard of living and we have a decent standard of living, there's no way we can take that $500 billion and just share it out amongst all people who will ever live, even though we don't know how many people will live. So that's why we need to transition off fossil fuels and think of human rights in other terms. So someone might think, okay, so I know the target, a society, a world in which people can enjoy their human rights. And secondly, I know that when traveling to there, we should think of energy and agriculture and ensure that people's human rights are respected there. Isn't that all? And that's where I come to my third kind of theme or thesis, which is that unfortunately, some of the policies that we could use to get to a sort of a safer, ecologically safer world have harmful side effects. Side effects which can undermine other people's human rights. And I listed other energy sources earlier. It'd be great if we could just implement them, they're low cost, and they don't have any malign side effects. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So I'll give you two examples. One is about renewables, and one is about the UN program on reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So in the last decade, as some of you may know, that the US and the EU had quite an aggressive renewables policy and pledged to ensure that fuel, for example, a certain percentage of it came from things like biofuels. But unfortunately, biofuels policies can have and have been alleged to have quite serious side effects. So I was part of a team working on biofuels for the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and in our report, which I linked to there, we chronicled some of our allegations made about biofuels policy, that, for example, it leads to a spike in food prices because people are growing crops for fuel rather than food. It's immensely complicated to evaluate that because there are many things which affect food prices. So in all of these examples, I'm not saying, yeah, this is a definitive case of a rights violation. My point is more just to persuade you that the path to a sustainable society has to be aware of these human rights constraints. And if biofuels overstep them, then we shouldn't pursue biofuels. Or at least we shouldn't pursue first-generation biofuels if they have those effects. Labour rights violations. There were accusations of basically slave labour in Brazilian biofuel plants. And then palm oil is used to produce biofuels, and there are allegations of land grabs in Malaysia. And you can see the rationale. You take land from indigenous people, you grow the crops, and then you take the profits. RED, kind of similar concerns have been expressed. So the idea underlying RED, the very core basic idea, is that people can be remunerated for not engaging in deforestation. And I think that sounds a fantastic idea. You are perhaps helping some of the world's poorest, and you're also preventing dangerous climate change. But there are going to be problems. There are problems in whether those people who use the land are those who receive the compensation. And so concerns have been raised about whether this led to forcible displacement, about denying people access to the forests, and so they were denied a decent standard of living, while other people could take the benefits. And so the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination investigated complaints about these kinds of things in Indonesia. So the third thesis really then is we need a human rights compatible pathway to a safer climate. We can't just say any old thing, as long as it reduces emissions will do. And then just to give you a taster, I mean, here are other issues where human rights might have something to say. So if human rights does jeopardize people's right to a safe and healthy environment, or if fracking leads to threats to people's health, or if hydroelectric leads to forcible displacement, or if geoengineering leads to health problems, then you can see why, I mean, from a human rights point of view, these are going to be intensely problematic. So just to sum up so far, I think human rights enter the picture in these three ways. As an explanation of why climate change is such a severe and important threat, as something that should guide how we think about mitigation, and as a constraint on adaptation or geoengineering or mitigation policies. We have a tendency to forget this third one and to sort of say, we'll do whatever it takes. And one reason, I think, is many of the harmful effects are felt by the most vulnerable and most marginalized, who have the least ability to stick up for themselves. But again, I think this is one virtue of a human rights approach, that it can help speak to those concerns. Okay, so someone might think at this point, okay, we've had lots of principles, and my goodness, isn't it going to be looking really hard to actually do anything to get there? You're sort of tying our hands behind our back in our attempts to get there. So can we talk a little bit about policies, about what we should do? So let me talk about that. And my fourth theme is, I think human rights can help us sort of think about some of the long-run challenges. Now, some of these, I think, are just going to be determined quite largely by the economics of it, and people like Cameron Hepburn, who are, I think, are speaking an 8th week, can speak to those. From a human rights point of view, you could say, look, you can choose many different policies, and I'm going to list some, as long as they help secure a safe climate, and as long as they do so in a way that doesn't undermine human rights, that's fine. So you could use carbon taxes, price mechanisms. But if you do, you need to make sure that you're not triggering fuel poverty and leaving people without the right to a decent minimum standard of living. But that can be done. I mean, it's hard, but it can be done. Or you might go for what economists call quantity restrictions and have a cap and then issue permits to people or to governments. And most people favor a system, if they go down this route, of allowing people to trade them. Now, there's an enormous variety of systems here. You could allocate permits to governments or to firms. You could auction them off to firms, or you could do what the EU did in 2005 and give them free to firms. Or you could give individuals them. You could give each and every one of you a carbon card. Or you could auction off rights to emit greenhouse gases, which is what the EU is moving towards, and what people like Oliver Tickell and Eleanor Ostrom, the late Eleanor Ostrom, argued for. I mean, their idea is you auction them off and then you use the money that you get to assist the world's poor, to enable research into clean technology and to help fund adaptation. So we could do all of these things. A human rights point of view just says, yeah, whichever one you choose here, make sure they comply with those other principles we gave earlier. Or you could use regulations and have mandatory energy efficiency standards for fridges or for cars or for construction. So in a way I want to say, look, I'm still leaving you plenty of choice. But is there anything more that a human rights approach can say here apart from you can choose between those? Now here I'm going to tread on kind of perhaps more difficult and controversial water and say, well, yes, it can, and we have to look at some of the deep underlying drivers of climate change. And so now I want to talk about population, and this is a topic which often elicits very strong reactions. But I think we just can't avoid it. So let me say a few things about population and its relationship to climate change, and then a kind of a human rights approach. So it matters in part because human population has quadrupled in 100 years, and because according to the UN, we're projected to hit levels of 9.22 billion in 2075. There are projections it'll decrease later, but since it's one of the variables that determines environmental impact, it's just irrational to ignore it. Many people might be familiar with this IPAT formula I've put down here. I don't wholly endorse the formulation I'm using here because I think it's a bit more complicated, but I think the core idea is unassailable, which is environmental impact on the world, whether it's through greenhouse gases or through other kinds of ways we affect the natural world, will depend on the number of people there are. It depends on how much they consume. That's what affluence means there. And it depends on the type of technology they have available. The more consumption and the more people and the less technology, the worse it's going to be. So if someone says, look, population, that's a hot potato, we can't talk about it, they're ignoring one of the three crucial variables there. Just to explain why I'm not totally happy with it, I mean, other people have argued that things like urban infrastructure make a big difference, where it's not really things like the level of consumption, but how people live, or just whether people live together in households. So if couples divorce, for example, that affects their greenhouse gas emissions. But let's just focus on the simple version. Brian O'Neill says, this could contribute massively, 16 to 29% of the reductions in emissions needed. I will add, I don't think he says how we're going to reduce population growth, and that leaves the question about whether the methods people use will actually increase emissions, and you just can't ignore that. So, those who take a human rights approach say, well, we have something positive to contribute to this discussion, because people have human rights which ought to be realized, but the realization of which will positively sort of contribute to dealing with dangerous climate change. So I quote here from some research by John Bongartz. It says 20.44 million unwanted births per year occur in the developing world because people have inadequate access to contraception, or because they lack funding to pay for contraception, or because there's severe social pressures against using contraception. Now, clearly some people will be worried about Western values being imposed there, and you get into a hard debate. From a human rights point of view, women have a right to reproductive autonomy here, and if people have that right, then they're entitled to access to contraception. And if they have that access to contraception, then there will be a decrease in those pregnancies and a decrease in environmental pressures. people also have rights to education and employment. And Wolfgang Lutz and his colleagues have argued over many years that honouring people's right to education and employment, especially women's rights to those, will also decrease the number of children being born. It's a common finding amongst demographic studies that human right to an adequate standard of living has a similar effect, because people are having children as a social security net to look after them when they're older. So I think people are entitled to these anyway, and they have rights to them anyway. But realizing these will help us deal with some of the underlying drivers. Now, I'm going to emphasize some things here, because people often say, well, hang on, are you saying the problem is all about people in a developing country having lots of children? Haven't you looked at what causes dangerous climate change and people's high emissions in affluent Western countries over a long period of time? So this is why I'm not saying that the responsibility lies here with developing countries and it's their fault. That's just mistaken, because the per capita environmental footprint of those in countries like Bangladesh or India, are just a fraction of those in the US or in the EU. And if you look at the historical record, that picture just gets kind of ramified even further. And I think people have the right to develop, a right to meet an adequate standard of living. So that would forbid, at least in the first instance, them having responsibilities. So this is not about blaming developing countries, but what I am saying is we just can't ignore population, and that people have human rights, women have human rights to reproductive autonomy, to education, to employment, and that this can make a positive contribution. So human rights can help us get there. Now, I want to say something else about policy, and then I'll come to my final theme. If you look at that IPAT formula, it talks about consumption levels, population levels, and technology. I want to say something about technology. If you look at the world at the moment, we have something like 1.3 billion people without access to electricity. So any talk of them reducing their consumption seems obscene. In their cases, we actually need to increase energy. We need to reduce our consumption levels. But even if we did that, I think we just need to invest and transfer clean technology. So what we have to do then is both keep energy at a sustainable level in terms of environmental emissions, but increase it so that the world's poor can meet their most core and basic needs and rights. This is then when people reach for things like energy efficiency. But it seems to me then we have an important role here for investment in and transfer of clean technology. But the figures on investment in this are just extremely disappointing, that investment in this is going down. So here's a kind of a rights-oriented thought here, which is people talk about rights to intellectual property. There's an intellectual property regime designed to protect people's rights to their technological innovations. Drawing on some work by people like Thomas Pogge and Matthew Rimmer and others, I want to suggest, well, can we rethink our systems of intellectual property to incentivize people to produce lots of clean technology and to distribute those to the world's poor? And so the idea of a health impact fund, which people like Pogge have pioneered, says that we should incentivize by giving high revenues to those who produce, in this case, medicines that the world's poor need but can't afford to pay. And they will get paid in accordance to how much their medicines are spread around the world and make a positive contribution to the global health burden. So the thought then here is, why can't we do the same for technology and design the intellectual property system that would reward entrepreneurs and innovators, scientists, for coming up with ways of devising clean technology that don't particularly benefit people like you and me with our access to iPhones and whatever, but those who need to create clean, sustainable energy, let's say in sub-Saharan Africa. So this isn't really about a human right here, except insofar as I think we need a technological revolution and a transfer revolution to realize those human rights. But so I don't think it's all about population. It's not all about price controls and distributing emissions. It's about incentivizing clean technology. Okay, my final kind of human rights theme. So far, it's all been very much about what political philosophers would call substantive rights. That is, what rights you have to certain goods, like food, water, education, mobility. But who decides? Right? We have these COP negotiations coming up in Paris. Who should decide there? Who should be included in that? And many people invoke this idea of procedural justice. And the core idea of procedural justice is that if you are profoundly affected by a decision, if you're a stakeholder, if you're bound by the laws of a decision maybe, then you have a right to inclusion in that process. You have a right to take part, because otherwise your life is being determined by forces beyond your control. So I think you also have procedural rights as human beings. And this means at the global level that it shouldn't just be a small clique of unelected, unaccountable people making decisions that profoundly dictate how people lead their lives. At the national level, at the subnational and local level. Now, I talk about inclusion. I mean, inclusion is a deliberately vague word because clearly we can't all participate in a COP negotiation. But what's required is something that could be genuinely inclusive, where, let's say, all people's voices are adequately represented. And there are lots of innovative and creative ways we can do that. What it is worried about is where one group of people are ultimately deciding for everyone else with no input, with no contribution in any kind of way. But these procedural rights matter not just for mitigation policies, but also adaptation. And they matter not just at the global or national level, crucially at the local level. So if Oxford, for example, is trying to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, there should be a debate at the Oxford city level about whether there should be a congestion charge, for example, or whether there should be other ways of reducing the carbon footprint. Now, sometimes people worry, well, if you have these procedural rights, how do they fit in with the substantive ones? I mean, maybe if you allow everyone to take part, they're just going to choose something that won't meet our targets. So I'm just going to say, no, that meeting the targets is absolutely crucial. We must design policies and implement policies that protect people's human rights. But to go back to an earlier point, there's lots of indeterminacy there. There's lots of flexibility. For example, there's flexibility about how we realize our rights to energy, for example. Should they be through solar or geothermal? Should they, should we use a certain kinds of urban infrastructure that involves much less traffic? So there are lots of different ways of enjoying rights. And I think this is where procedural rights come in. They enable us to choose which ones those affected would prefer to do themselves. The same is true of responsibilities. People have responsibilities to reduce emissions, but there's many different ways of doing this. We can be using taxes or quotas or regulations. So I see that the substantive rights define the parameters which we must all honor, but then procedural rights give us flexibility that we can choose our own path to bring about a sustainable world. Okay, so that's the end of the kind of broadcast for why human rights should be linked with climate change, because I just think they're everywhere. If you think about what counts as dangerous climate change and what we should be preventing, that's where theme 1 comes in. It's a threat to human rights. But theme 2 then says, well, when thinking about mitigation and our carbon budget, we must also respect human rights. And the third message then was, unfortunately, many mitigation and adaptation policies have undesirable side effects. And we just shouldn't choose ones that have harmful side effects in the sense that they compromise human rights. And then more positively, I wanted to say, well, human rights may be at least part of the solution, that if you respect people's reproductive rights, their rights to an adequate standard of living, that will have a positive effect on population size in the sense of it decreases it. I could also say if you respect a right for migration, that would also assist it. And then the final point was about inclusion and governance, that this is not an issue where everything should be decided top down, but where people have human rights to shape the decisions that affect their lives. So I'll end there and I welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. That was illuminating and very insightful. We've got plenty of time for questions, so who wants to go first? No one? You're being shy.
I'm just wondering what this government's, well, I know it's maybe about to change, attitude is, because I've had a bit of experience of trying to implement human rights, and the government was trying to, replace it with the Bill of Rights and not sign up to the UN Convention on Human Rights. So I'm just wondering what hope there is.
Yes, I wish I was giving a talk. Well, maybe you don't on the 8th of May, when things might be a little clearer. But even then, yes, I'm not sure how clear it'll be on the 8th of May either. I think it does depend a lot on the next election. And so when Ed Miliband was at the Department for the Environment and Climate Change, he did take a very strong stance on it. If you look at what he said at Copenhagen, I think he took climate change seriously, and I'm not sure he couched it in terms of human rights, but I don't think he would particularly dissent from any of these. If the verdict is otherwise, then I'm not sure that human rights or indeed climate change will get that much of a look in.
Next question.
Thank you for a very enlightening talk. Working as I do for an NGO and kind of a pressure group to try and change the UNFCCC, it's very interesting to try and see another kind of dialogue brought to this kind of frame. So I was wondering what we can learn from the human rights conventions and from the human rights dialogue when we're trying to change things outside of the UK, which is what we're often trying to do, because countries frequently throw up the kind of shield of sovereignty when you're trying to change what they're doing in their own countries. So what can we learn from human rights conventions and the human right kind of approach to try and change things outside of the country in which we're living when we're trying to influence the UNFCCC?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting, hard one. I think two things that immediately spring to mind is many of them are quite supportive of a human rights approach because I think they sincerely believe in some of these socioeconomic rights and they see it as a direct threat. So I mentioned the Mali Declaration. I know small island states are very happy to see it, and I've talked at occasions where they have been very much pushing the human rights point of view. But yes, your reference to the shield of sovereignty draws attention to another aspect, which is when you're asking them to implement policies, then things get harder. And when you're talking about distributing emission rights, often countries like to think of these as the government has the emissions quota. And I think there's just an uphill battle that involves sort of courting NGOs and civil society actors in those countries to try and find ways not to allow that to stymie it. For example, think about clean technology. Suppose entrepreneurs do invest massively in clean technology and they produce it. That might be a way of bypassing some of the power of sovereign states, so that if, for example, people can store it through solar energy in easy, small formats, then I kind of see that as a way of getting past what a government would do. Whereas if you hand a government a chunk of emission rights, then, yeah, it's very hard. So I think human rights activists are always wanting to try and break through the outer rim that sovereignty poses. And I think there are things to be learned from other campaigns about, like there's a basic income campaign which has a similar strategy of giving each citizen enough income to survive and giving people mobile phones where they can access bank accounts as ways of going right to the people. So I think you'll find them as allies on one aspect, but maybe as adversaries on others.
Thank you, Simon. Very nice. I know I'm not a moral philosopher, but I do have a question. It seems to me that human rights are usually couched in terms of individual rights, rights of individuals. And I just wanted to point towards a practice which, in the context when you talked about the right not to be forcibly displaced, which you seem to have couched in the terms of human rights, where we do have legal expropriations.
Yeah.
And which are actually justified in terms of the common good. How does this work with the human rights?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just finding the other bit where I don't think I appeal to that particular right, but I think I mentioned other possible ones. Yes. I know Benito, so he's being modest in his "I'm not a moral philosopher," which is not true here. But yeah, I think the better formulation would be not to be arbitrarily displaced. So that I think people would recognize that there are often public interest reasons that you could move someone, whether it's to choose a very ungreen case, a motorway. In the US, I think there's eminent domain. So there are practices, but you need a very good public interest reason to do it. What you can't do is say, well, because I want to maintain my high consumption lifestyle, I can do something. So imagine, one of your neighbors here decides to build an enterprise which makes it unlivable in your house through tremors or flooding or infectious diseases. So it's unoccupied and you have to move. I'm sure you would call that a rights violation. So yeah, I should have put arbitrarily in there, but I don't think the arbitrarily kind of empties it of content. Does that help address that? Thanks.
Thank you, Professor, for the speech. That was most enlightening. But I've got one question about whether or not framing the climate negotiations in terms of human rights will help there be an agreement in Paris or not. Most obviously, a country like China doesn't subscribe to the same set of human rights as our common currency, and other parts of the world perhaps wouldn't agree perhaps with employment rights for women or education even. So is that a unifying cause or framework within which we might all reach agreement, do you think? Thank you.
Yeah, I think, two things on that. It might be that it's not. It might be that the best thing to do is to not use that language in negotiations, that it raises some people's hackles and it becomes an obstacle. That's quite possible. I suppose what I would want to say there is still, it is a human rights issue, but it just might not be politic to use that language. And I'm quite happy with that. On the other hand, I think a lot of people are often quite happy to use it who you might not think otherwise. And maybe it depends which human rights one's emphasizing. If it's the right to develop, then China will affirm that. But ultimately, I think the question is a good one, but it's a question about strategy. And sometimes when you're negotiating with people, you don't give them the best moral reasons you see it. You're just trying to get a good agreement and a good compromise. And it is interesting that sometimes it drifts out of the formulation. So it was in the Cancun one. I haven't seen any drafts of the Paris ones. Perhaps someone here has. And I'd be interested to know whether it's dropped out or not. Because there are forces that always want them back in to say, we need these kind of safe thresholds to protect us. And without that, we are concerned about it.
Thank you for the talk. My question goes back to sort of the discussion about sovereignty and kind of it being used as a shield. One of the issues here, I think, is with the language of rights, because who's going to guarantee these rights, which has often been an issue in terms of talking about human rights in any sphere. A lot of our understanding of rights is tied to notions of citizenship. And when you're talking about this, particularly when you're talking about people who are citizens of sovereign states where they may have to flee because of the results of climate change, how are we supposed to kind of use this language in order to deal with that? It seems like what you're actually asking for is a fundamental rethinking of how we organize ourselves politically. A sovereign state may not be the answer to that, particularly if you're dealing with sovereign states like China or the US or others that don't want to kind of recognize other citizens of other countries' rights, but still are definitely affecting them. This may not help with negotiations coming up in Paris, but it seems like this is actually a call for something much, much bigger than just asking people to respect somebody's human rights. It's a rethinking of how we organize ourselves politically, because it's not enough to get around sovereignty to just give people clean energy sources. There's more to it than that, so I just wanted your comment on that.
Can I ask a bit more, when you say there's more to it, that might be for different reasons. So one might be that I'm kind of being silent on what kind of political structures there should be. Or it might be I'm not saying really who the duty bearers are. And both of those are true. I'm trying to say as little about those as possible because although important, and I think about them a lot and work on them, I'm trying to get as much progress as we can without delving into that. So, for example, I don't think a system of states is an optimal way of organizing humanity. I think the idea of sovereignty, which is often traced back to the Treaty of Westphalia, has inherent limitations, and some powers should go global and some should go downwards, and why should we have territorial modes of governance? But I'm trying to be ultra-realistic and think, well, even moderately realistic, you think that's not going to happen, right? That's not going to happen very time soon. So I want to live in and use the world we currently have. And in the short term, we do have states with borders which they police and regulate and try and control. I'm just trying to think strategically. So if I think people in a country with a kleptocracy in charge, how can we best fulfill their rights? And I think we have duties as human beings to do this. And the short-term one is, are there ways of either bringing that state on board or bypassing it, as I put it. But then, if you wanted to know the bigger picture, we'd need a longer conversation about citizenship and rights and so on. But I hope you can see why I'm trying to avoid that, because that's biting off an awful lot. But the fuller answer would talk about that. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. It seems very applicable, the human rights framework, with respect to a lot of the kind of procedural elements of justice that we've talked about. Right. It's much less obvious to me if we're living in the at least quasi-realistic world how these elements of procedural justice, which I think you commented would perhaps best be addressed from a bottom-up process, can somehow be maintained through this rights framework. Could I just push you a little more and ask you, in practice, what would it mean to maintain procedural rights? Yeah.
I think it's a really big question, because we're talking about mitigation policies, adaptation ones, possibly even geoengineering ones, and they have all different levels. The easiest way to answer it is at the local level. You could say, as I was saying about Oxford, you might talk about cities or smaller regional units, and you can imagine there being a consultative process where we collectively decide. We might say, look, Oxford's got to reduce its emissions by X, and here's a bunch of ways of doing it, which all would achieve that. We have leeway, which one should we do? But the harder version of your question might be, well, what does this really mean for COP negotiations and that kind of thing, where we're talking about the whole of humanity. So I suppose there are different types of rights. There are rights to be informed and consulted, where you can imagine communities deliberating and transmitting their views upwards in some kind of chain. But then if you look at the actual COP negotiations, there's quite an interesting idea put forward by an Australian colleague of mine called Robin Eckersley, who she favours a kind of what she calls, I think it's inclusive minilateralism. So let me explain what that means. On the one hand, you can have a multilateral inclusive process at the COP negotiations, which includes all the state parties, often seen as a recipe for deadlock, right? How are you going to get anywhere? And then you have some other people who favour a minilateral approach, where you say, look, we'll just get the world's 7 greatest emitters in the room, and they'll hammer out something. Or maybe it's just China and the US, and maybe the EU, and that's a minilateral one. But there's a real worry there, I think substantively, about whether they'd achieve a just outcome, because are the world's highest emitters necessarily going to choose a target that is adequate for the most vulnerable communities? If I were Bangladesh, I wouldn't think, hey, China and the US, you go else and sort it out. But there's also worry about legitimacy, and if you follow, say, the 2009 Copenhagen one, there was a huge uproar because there was a secret text that was created, and many people felt alienated, and the whole process was discredited. So what Robin Eckersley has suggested is we've got this minilateral one which may not work, which is illegitimate. We've got this multilateral one which is inclusive, but is it going at deadlock? Is there some way of marrying the insights of both, where you could have a multilateral process where everyone is included, but then they vote out of all the parties there for, let's say, 7 or 8 offices to be in this small committee that takes the decisions. And there must be some from the vulnerable, most marginal, most harshly affected ones, so their voice is included, and there must be others from the highest emitting ones. Now, I don't know if that would work, and it had lots of critics by people who say, you don't really need this, because there's things like Friends of the Chair, who the chair sometimes appoints a group of people to provide consultation. But I do think it's sort of an illustration of an imaginative way of thinking. So wouldn't that be procedurally fairer than one where the major emitters just hammered it out? I don't really have a full, proper answer to the question. I keep thinking about it and not making much progress. And you might just think we have a terrible contrast between realizing substantive justice on the one hand and legitimacy on the other. But maybe I'll have criticisms or responses of that Eckersley proposal. But I put it forward as a way of thinking about what procedural rights might mean that could be operationalized perhaps at the global level.
Simon, thanks for a very interesting talk. And for those of us who work on mitigation policy, I thought your themes really nicely covered some of the tensions and the difficulties involved in operationalising it as well. I wanted to push you a bit on responsibilities. You gave a parallel between assault and climate change, and I can see that works in terms of rights not to be affected, but for assault, it gives me a very clear responsibility not to assault people. But I'm not sure how that works for climate change. It can't be that I have no right to emit anything. Is this about how does the responsibility framework flow from this? Do I have individual responsibilities? If so, to do what? Are there responsibilities that you talked about Oxford level? Is this purely for nation states, given the governance we've got? What's a good way to think about it?
No, really, really important question that I sort of deliberately set aside, but you're quite right to press me on it, because I mean, one crucial difference between the assault case is, and it's one that people will often emphasize, is there's a very clearly defined duty bearer. A should not do that to B. In fact, we all shouldn't do that. But climate change is different because it's a collective causal process with billions of people interacting. And so the way I think about it is this: we collectively, humanity, have a duty not to act in ways that deprive people of this. And just because it's lots of people doesn't make a difference. If, to use a fantastical example, there was a room next door with 1,000 little holes, or let's take it 100 holes, and they need the air to breathe, and if there were 100 of us here, we each put a finger on, we would collectively be killing that person. And if it was 1,000, the numbers don't make a difference. What matters is people have a right that this not be done. But then when I say humanity has this, we then have to talk about dispersing the responsibilities. And I think there's two kinds of things we have to do there, which both of which you raised. which is one is who's the duty bearer. Is it states have a duty not to do this, or individuals, or corporations, or universities? And then how do we distribute those? So in a way, the second theme was obliquely about this because it's what rights you have to emissions. But I would say it's the flip side here is about the duties. So if you have a right to subsistence emissions or development emissions, but no more, then you have a duty to not exceed that one. Now, I suppose the two kind of glosses I want to put on this here is whatever distribution of emissions we give, it shouldn't compromise human rights. That might permit quite a lot of different distributions, but ideally, whatever we do, it shouldn't compromise human rights. But then above that, you get these different principles that I'm sure you're well aware of, and others will be too, about, well, it should be the polluters, they're the ones who's responsible, or those with the greatest ability to pay, they should be the ones bearing the burden. And there are other ones too. So you can now see why I didn't touch it in a way, because it's a vast, sprawling one, but any answer about human rights has to give an answer to this. So in the context of this, I just want to say, however we distribute those emissions, they shouldn't compromise human rights. And then if someone wants more specificity, then we need a longer conversation. I'm very keen on the idea that people should, those who pollute should pay, and those with the greatest ability to pay should pay, and some combination of those.
Next, just behind you.
Hello. Building on what you just said, when we speak of rights internationally, we often are talking about the responsibility to protect and positive obligations to intervene to protect human rights. How far might that extend? Do countries, for example, have a right or a duty to levy tariffs to punish other countries that don't reduce their emissions?
Yeah. Interesting question. When you first framed it, I thought you were going to talk about intervention, like coercive intervention, which I would want to shy away from. But yeah, in some of my work, I've distinguished between two types of responsibility, and one is first order. I call it first order, which is to reduce emissions. And then there's a raft of second order ones, which are duties to do things which enable or incentivize others to comply with their first order duties. So you might think, I have a duty to reduce emissions. Politicians have a duty to create an urban environment that sort of facilitates or even encourages me to do that. And I just want to link that to what you said then, because you might think, people like Joseph Stiglitz have said something that was akin to what you said about using sanctions, because you might think a country, or just to use that as the unit, has a duty to reduce its emissions. And if it doesn't, then it falls on others to have what I'm calling these second order duties, to take action to ensure that others sort of comply. So that could mean slapping on some kind of tariff for those goods that aren't produced in the appropriate way. So I'm open to that. There are going to be lots of complications there. So one might be about who does this and who has the right to do this. So any country that has a really poor environmental record itself, I think, it would be inappropriate for it to do that. You can think of very heavy-handed and coercive and intrusive ways of doing this. But in principle, it seems, if you take these seriously as rights, I think that there's a rights violation going on now. If we take it seriously as rights, someone should not be committing that rights violation. And then there's what Henry Shue, my colleague, calls kind of another duty, which is the duty of the rest of us to take steps to secure that right by preventing other people from violating the rights. So I'm not sure what other policies you would want to put under that heading, or maybe you were worried about that one, but I mean, in principle, I'm quite happy with that. And so we might use things like membership of international institutions and say, you can only be a member if you have a credible path to a sustainable economy, or for the WTO, that it could use trade sanctions if it keeps supporting fossil fuels and not reducing emissions.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. You threw out the question, had anyone looked at the Geneva text for the Paris Agreement?
Right.
I did try to wade through it, but it's not a pleasant task. 91 pages of bracketed text, right. Because as we all know, the actual legal form that the agreement in Paris will take has been left open-ended, and that open-endedness has fed through to the draft. But two things strike me about it. One is, picking up your point on equitable access to sustainable development, there's very little reference to that in right. the agreement, and very little reference indeed to even what we might view as environmentally focused phraseology, a little bit about the resilience of ecosystems. And it raises for me a more troubling point, and I think this is, your whole talk actually is partly redressing this, which is the way in which we frame climate change. Right. Now, I come to it from a legal perspective, and there's an emerging literature that talks about international climate change law. Yeah. Well, what is that? Is it a sui generis field? Is it human rights and environment and sustainable development? And I have a real concern that the broad foundations of climate change and climate change concerns are being obscured by a very narrow focus on very climate change specific type issues like detailed regulation of carbon emissions and trading, detailed regulation, mitigation, adaptation, forgetting the reasons behind that and why we're concerned. But it does raise for me a fundamental question from a legal perspective, which is the Climate Change Convention a human rights instrument? Is it an environmental instrument? And how does it affect the way in which we view the issue and the governance of climate change if we're pigeonholing it in one category or the other, rather than seeing integration between environment, human rights, and other areas? And that would be my preferred approach, and I suspect yours as well, because I think integration is a principle that underpins several of the points you're making about climate change through a human rights prism.
Yeah, no, I just think I wholeheartedly agree with the way you put it there, but I mean, you have much greater expertise than I do on the legal side. Actually, yeah, in my philosophical work on this, I defend a view called integrationism, which is all about seeing the way these things are profoundly interconnected. But can I kind of throw back a sort of question to you? I mean, I do think everything about the climate change regime is not framed in a human rights way. At least the starting point is not from that. So even like the IPCC reports, which are these enormous reports that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change do, they're not, when I look at the impacts, they don't frame them as human rights. The last one, to which I played a very minor role, did mention human rights language, but they would just think of what are bad impacts and they put it in there. So even the very language in which the IPCC uses is not couched in terms of human rights. And there has been a push by some, like David Victor, for example, to say the way these things are framed, just purely in the scientific literature, should be much more informed by social sciences, and I'm sure you'd add law as well. But I suppose the question I kind of want to push back to you is, do you think there's a change in this? I mean, yes, it's not framed in necessarily the best kind of way at the moment, but 5, 10, 15 years ago, I think it was even worse. Well, that's not a question. Put a question mark at the end of that. Do you not think there's some kind of progress? Because lawyers are, as you're very well aware, making many more pronouncements and statements on this, like the International Bar Association and others. So do you think there's progress, or are you happy to answer?
Yes, I'm happy to answer. Well, you mentioned the IBA report, which I think is quite interesting because it's framing climate change as a climate justice issue and explicitly linking it with human rights concerns. And I suspect that part of the reason for increasing human rights framing of climate change issues because of concerns about migration, for example, and displacement of populations. So it's more in the context of looking at the effects of climate change and its impact on human populations, rather than framing climate change as, amongst other things, a human rights issue. So I would say that human rights framing has come into it in terms of the impacts. I'm not so sure we're seeing human rights framing in terms of how we perceive climate change and responses per se.
Yeah.
So it's part of the Band-Aid, if you will, rather than looking at the underlying motivations and causes.
I mean, this is one point where it might be worth me just saying, which is probably obvious to quite a few people, but the way that political philosophers such as myself think about the responsibilities is just very, very different from the way that is often the case in law. And so the human rights responsibility for people like myself would just fall on other human beings, and maybe globally, rather than in the first instance the state of which one is a citizen. And maybe I was wondering if you have a law background, or so sometimes there's a slight mismatch in discourses in that sense as well, which when you start talking about the duty bearers that Nick was asking about as well, then sometimes people think, well, a human rights framework as traditionally perceived in legal terms is not a helpful way of thinking about this, although there are provisions about duties to cooperate.
Right, we've got time for one more question. So in the green, just, yeah.
Thank you. Suppose we're not smart enough to come up with policies that protect all human rights all of the time. Does a human rights framework reduce down to a kind of cost-benefit analysis, especially if you've got provision for loss and damage compensation?
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I sort of, in my mind, prepared someone saying something a little like that, but slightly different, saying, well, but what if you can't have it all, right? And that would be, are you thinking of a scenario where whatever you do, you're going to, yes. And I think this is a really real prospect, and I don't think we're there yet, but we have to think about it. So I suppose my two thoughts on this are, I still think it's helpful to frame it as a human rights issue. Maybe it relates to what you said about compensation and loss and damage, but it captures, I think, the moral reality of the situation, where it's as if you're driving a trolley and you must kill A or you must kill B. Whatever you're going to do, you're going to violate a human right. And I think we should preserve that language. We should say that's why it's a tragic situation. And if the person isn't killed, then they're entitled to compensation. But you might think, okay, maybe fine, but what should we actually do? Should we do it in a purely cost-benefit way? And I think there's a distinctive human rights way of thinking about trade-offs there. So you wouldn't necessarily maximize happiness or well-being. You might have a more prioritarian approach and focus on the least advantaged. But when I've thought about this, I can't think of any really simple formulae. So the obvious variables are how many people are affected. So if you have a shortfall, you have to look at how badly off they are, how many people are affected, how far beneath a decent standard they all fall. Because my temptation is to say, well, you should just choose whichever causes the least harm to the most vulnerable. But that's, A, not necessarily true. It might be that there's not much you can do for the most vulnerable, and you'd be jeopardizing people who are just a little bit above that. But as a general rule of thumb, I think it just seems consonant with the human rights approach to say something like the focus should always be on the individual there and the most vulnerable. But I'm reluctant to be more specific because I don't have a formula that would apply in all cases. So I don't think you should say, oh, we should ensure as many people as possible get over the human rights threshold, because you can think of counterintuitive cases there. So I don't think it's a purely cost-benefit analysis, but I do think we need a kind of plurality of principles, and it'd be probably, rather intuitionistic. One thing a rights view might add there is you need some procedurally fair way of actually deciding this tragic case. So, if you have lifeboat scenarios, it matters that people draw lots rather than the strongest overpower the weak or something like that.
On that note, it feels feels a rather gloomy note to end on, but I think that was probably inevitable given the subject tonight. Thank you so much to everybody for your insightful and thoughtful questions. As always, it's a really great discussion. Please do try and make it back for more of the seminars, same time every Thursday this term. We really value your input. And thank you very much, Simon. That was great.
Okay. Thanks, all.